Hi, this is Tracy Beal. I am the Executive Director of School Connect, and I'm here with Brad Snyder. He is the chair of the Arizona Adverse Childhood Experiences Consortium. And I'm so glad to be with you here, Brad, because, man, we've been going through a lot as a community in these last days, last months, really, because of the pandemic. And so I just wanted to have you have a conversation with you so that we could talk a little bit about trauma. Really, our kids, our parents, our educators have been going through remote learning, physical distancing, loss of relationships, loss of people and family celebrations, racial injustice, natural disasters. Like it's almost like we need a collective pause and a breath just to take in everything that has been happening these last several months. And so I just wanted to ask you, first of all, can you kind of describe trauma and what the results are for us?
Well, sure. So first of all humans experience adversity, experience these moments that really cause our body to react and take over. And because our bodies process this adversity as a real physical, dangerous threat to us. Mm-hmm. And these processes are kind of fascinating. They're kind of wonderful, actually. So our sympathetic nervous system gets triggered. We have an amygdala sending a signal to the hypothalamus, and it sets off a bunch of processes that are really quite valuable to our survival. You know, our heart rates increase, our lungs expand to take in more oxygen.
To run away from a tiger, right?
Exactly. And this is incredibly, incredibly useful. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there are some physiological and psychological benefits of going into that aroused state if you're allowed to come out of it. Mm. And one of the things that happens when we're in this aroused state, which is really germane to our discussion of our children, especially our children as students, is that our prefrontal cortex, which is where all that executive functioning occurs. So that's where our ability to understand consequences occurs. That's when where some of our relationship skills are housed. Mm-hmm. That is our short-term memory is housed there. Mm-hmm. All of that gets compromised when we are in that trauma-aroused state, because actually some of those processes hold us back when we're really in danger.
They take too much time.
Well, you don't want to be calculating the odds of beating the bear, right? So if you're encountering that example,
run fast.
Exactly. Just run, just fight it, or run fast, or curl up and freeze and take the punishment. You don't want to calculate the odds or think about the consequences. Mm-hmm. So that's awesome, right? Now, the problem happens when we aren't allowed that opportunity to come down out of that aroused state.
Mm-hmm. Get our brain back together. Let it hold it for ourselves, right? Be able to control it. Mm-hmm.
And so the more adversity we encounter without going into that relaxed state, the more likely we are to jump into that aroused state. Mm. So it seems like that adversity, trauma, is exactly the opposite of a callus, right? So the physical pain that you get that causes you, if you've been working with your hands a lot, those calluses protect you from the pain in the future. Mm-hmm. In reality, with trauma, the more trauma we experience, the more likely we are to feel traumatized.
So it's like an open wound. Suddenly there's something that touches us off.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you know, the example that our colleague Nadine Burke-Harris uses is that the more bears we encounter, mm-hmm. the more likely we are to see bears. So we start to anticipate them. We start to see them around corners, sometimes where they don't exist. Mm-hmm. Now, again, that's kind of this beautiful thing that our bodies do. It's kind of, I think it's kind of magnificent, except that we have students that are experiencing what some people call toxic levels of trauma or adversity. Mm-hmm. And as a result, that prefrontal cortex of theirs is being constantly, sometimes permanently, compromised. And just think of what that does to their schoolwork, to their learning, mm-hmm. to their relationships. It creates barriers. They don't have access to their short-term memories that they need for their tests, right? They don't understand consequences, so it makes it very hard for them to plan. It makes it very hard for us to reward them and to get the kind of behaviors that we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
And
what's
you would
happening.
think this is really intense during this period of time because
Yeah.
so many things are coming at them that they're
Right.
just kind of constantly aware and reacting, right? Reactive.
Absolutely. And people tell us that that feeling when you're in that trauma aroused state is one of incredible helplessness. Things are happening to you and you have very little power over them.
No control.
And doesn't that describe our world right now
Yes,
for
it
some
does.
people? And so that constant fear, that constant feeling of being in danger and being powerless over your own person.
And this is probably happening not only, like you said, with kids, with students, which is our focus at this moment because of schools, but also to their parents and also to educators. So now you've got 3 different groups of people who are all reactive because of the trauma that is going on, right?
And our children are feeling the trauma of their parents. So
Good
because there's a couple reasons that this happens. First of all, we've seen in a trend of generational changes in parenting that the modern parent is much more likely to share their stressors with their children, verbally tell them about them, than parents in the past were. An example, Tracy, when I was a kid, a lot of my peers would say things like, well, we grew up poor, but we never knew it. Today's children, if their parents are poor, the kids know it.
So the parents knew how to put a face on for their kids and kind of moderate things in the past more. And now kids are riding the roller coaster ride of what their parents' experience is. That's what you're saying.
Much more participatory. And children are naturally susceptible or attuned to signaling. So even when parents aren't sharing, specifically, explicitly their stress, are children who are modeling machines.
They're in tune with their parent.
They're picking up all the little signals that are happening.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we know there's trauma going on.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about core principles of building resilience. So can you describe that and help us? Let's come away today with some real practical tips about how we can ourselves build resilience and how we can help our kids build some resilience.
Absolutely. So the first thing that parents and educators need to do to help our children be resilient is to make sure that they themselves are healthy. And when I'm using the big healthy here. So we want our parents and our educators to be regulated in their own emotional state.
What does regulated mean? So many people would not identify with that term.
Absolutely. Well, we hear this term mindful an awful lot, and it's gotten to be a buzzword. I mean, I think that you can buy, mindful sports drinks now. In reality,
I wish it was that easy.
I wish it were. I wish it were. But it's when things become buzzwords, it's often useful to unpack them a little bit and look at what they literally mean.
Right.
Remember, I said at the beginning that our bodies react to adversity. It's a physical thing.
Right.
It happens before we're even conscious or can make a decision about it. Being mindful is being attuned to your body's reaction to stress so that you can reverse the process, stop that trauma arousal before it robs you of your higher levels of thinking.
So recognize that you're stressed, basically.
Recognize
and be able to take a pause.
Take a pause and do a few things to actually, so you've got your sympathetic nervous system that's causing that aroused state. You've got a parasympathetic nervous system that you can also engage to relax you and bring you out of that aroused state. And doing it, and again, that's the neuroscience. So when I give you some of these techniques, know that it's all based in science, even if it sounds a little bit more spiritual, especially coming from somebody who clearly looks like a hippie. I'm
glad that you have science behind you as well.
It does.
That's good.
So the parasympathetic nervous system you can trigger it by reversing some of what the sympathetic nervous system has caused. So the shallowness of breath and the elevated heart rate, you
Mm-hmm.
can begin to undo simply by allowing yourself that pause to take that deep breath. And I know we've heard that so much that it almost has become meaningless, but that breathing in, the
Mm-hmm.
lengthening your breath and making sure that you have a full exhale
Mm-hmm.
actually can trigger that parasympathetic nervous system. We know what it's doing on a neuroscience level.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is when you are entering an aroused state, you clench up. You
Mm.
become like a spring ready to do something. You become this tense ball
Ready to
and
jump away.
ready to jump or run or fight, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, simply undoing the clenching
Mm-hmm.
can begin to bring you out of that state and trigger
Mm-hmm.
that parasympathetic response. So being mindful is, oh, look, my heart rate's going up, I'm clenching, I'm standing still, my breathing is shallow. So by being mindful of how our own bodies are reacting to the stress, we can do those things, move around, relax, wiggle,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
take deep breaths.
Yeah.
And those things can undo that. So we start there and make sure that we ourselves are regulated, that is, not in an aroused state, when we enter into a conversation or relationship with our children or students.
So what you're saying is when we take the initiative to kind of be aware of ourselves, to take a deep breath and to kind of relax before we start interacting with our kid, that's going to help us bring that to our child.
100%. And then we can teach our children those very techniques.
Mm-hmm.
This is core to some of what I see as the goal of SEL. We can teach these techniques of self-regulation, of being mindful to our children and to our students.
And SEL is social emotional learning, right?
Exactly.
So that it's actually simpler than we recognize. Sometimes we think something that has scientific names are complex and difficult for us to do. But you're saying just by recognizing ourselves, taking that deep breath, relaxing, and then my understanding is touching your child, connecting with them, as well as that breath and that relaxing, that also makes the connection, which gives that safety that helps them kind of start to calm down.
So when we ourselves are not caught up in our own stress, in our own head, then we can address a relationship. And we can address that relationship. Like I teach, I go back to active listening skills with teachers and parents. I also talk about compartmentalization. Now, that has been a bad term in some psychological literature because it talks about unintegrated experiences or feelings, but there's a second definition of compartmentalization, which is when you give activities their own space and time free of distraction. And I think we need to compartmentalize. Yes.
You're all the way present.
Exactly. You've set the phone aside, you've turned off the news, you're not taking calls, and you're focused on your child. And when you're talking to the child, you're making that eye contact. They know that you're not looking down to check your messages, your texts, your email.
Right.
You're practicing active listening skills, which is repeating what you just was said to you so that other person knows that it was heard, maybe restating it like you've been doing in our interview.
Yes.
Validating that they've been sharing. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. That means a lot that you could tell me about that. And then also helping our children label the emotions that they're feeling.
Wow, that's so hard, isn't it, for kids?
It is.
Isn't that challenging?
It's step number one. In any curriculum for SEL, step number one is helping our children understand their emotions and label them so that they can begin to address them appropriately.
Am I afraid? Am I anxious? Am I angry? Am I frustrated? These are all different kinds of emotions that kids could be having. And when they're able to kind of identify it and say it and have somebody hear it and somebody validate it, then it's like, okay, we all know. And now we can take the pause, and then that gives us kind of a foundation to try to move forward.
Yep. I mean, it's amazing how that emotional vocabulary also affords us more ways to deal with our emotions. Without that emotional vocabulary, our children tend to be limited in their emotions. So something happens to them, adversity, and it all gets processed as anger, or it all gets processed as sadness.
So they're
Without that
reacting.
language,
It's just
yeah,
one huge reacting. It's
right.
a snowball, keeps growing and growing and growing. And then a parent or a teacher is saying, I've talked to you about this 100 times. How come you're not responding? And it's because they just have a snowball of emotion going on. They haven't identified what it is. Nobody's walked them through it. And so they don't have the skills they need to be able to keep walking all the way to the other side of that. And then have the chance when they do get in their right mind to be able to respond to an adult or an instruction or a learning experience.
Exactly. Exactly. How do they ask for help if they don't know and understand what they're feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And those compartmentalized moments with our children, whether they're our students or our children at home with us, those
Mm-hmm.
moments they're also learning those relationship skills, so
Mm-hmm.
that when they have a problem that they need to bring to an adult, they do have those skills, those abilities to communicate. All of
Right.
that is happening.
Right. So you're creating a pathway for them. And it's really a pathway back and forth, right? As parents learn to do this with their kids, they're learning it themselves, and then they're reinforcing it with each other, which has got to make a family incredibly strong, or a classroom, a teacher with their students. They're now creating almost a community of support, which allows everybody to relax and everybody to begin to relate well.
And that is resilience.
And that is resilience. Yay.
Yeah.
Yay. That's great. That's great. Well, Brad, thank you so much for kind of clarifying for us what trauma is, why we're experiencing it, what resilience is, and some really practical steps to get there. I so appreciate that. And I feel like this is literally for everybody. So obviously we're concerned about our kids, but this is, as you said, so important for the parent to be able to process this for themselves, to regulate so that they can calm down enough to be able to bring this to their children. And then for educators, the same thing, right? They need that support from parents and from back and forth with students to apply everything you've been talking about.
Exactly. You know, all of the things that we are going to give our children when we employ these practices, do the same thing for your partners, do the same thing for your friendships.
Yeah.
Give them all the space and the time, and devote your energy to keeping them strong.
Yeah, because that's what life is worth living for, right?
Agreed.
In the end. Yeah. So thank you again so much, Brad. We sure enjoyed having you.
You're very welcome. And thank you very much for doing this.